So if I stop for a second or two, that's because, you know, I want to tell you right away that I am not a camp survivor. I'm a child survivor. There's a big difference. When I was a little boy, I was hidden. When the war, I was born in 1939, when the war started, and my father hired a woman to try to find non-Jewish people to take care of me. So from the age of 2 to 4, I was placed with more than 11 different families. But the Germans, the Nazis told all the people where we lived in Belgium not to help Jewish people. And if they helped Jewish people, they would all be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. So the people who were helping me, they were afraid for their own families. And they would keep me for 3 weeks, a month and a half, whatever it came out. So I went from families to families from 2 to 4. At 4, my father thought that it was too dangerous to continue to doing it this way. And with the help of a Jewish community, he found a woman, a special woman, who would take me from Brussels, where we lived, to Namur. Normally it would be a couple of hours by car. But because all the Nazis were all over the place and checking everything, that little trip of 2 hours lasted 4.5 days. So we traveled at night through the forest, and we walked and we took the car. And by that time I was 4 years old. And the woman who took me, her name was Mademoiselle Andrée. And she was a very strict woman, and her job was simply to bring me from Brussels to Namur. And she told me, Alex, don't speak. And for 4 days, I didn't say one single word. I trusted her. And she was very strict, so I had no choice in the matter. Anyway, having said all that, when we got there, I was placed in an orphanage. And I stayed in that orphanage from the age of 4 to 7. So I stayed there for 3 years. I was there with my cousin, Annie, but instead of being my cousin during that time, my father had changed our names so that Annie and I became brother and sister. And we had the same last name. And my father thought that it would have been easier for us in case something happened to the 2 sets of parents, that we would be brother and sister. Anyways, we lasted for the 3 years. We are 7 years old. The war ended. We were waiting for our parents, and our parents weren't coming. We waited and waited. And then the orphanage thought that it was taking too long, and then they decided that they were going to keep us. When I say us, not just my sister and I, but we were a lot of kids. And they decided that we were going to stay for another 6 months. After 6 months, they said, that's enough. We can't stay here anymore. They drove us from Namur back to Brussels. We got to Brussels, and nobody came for us. And then they told us that all the Jewish kids that survived, if their parents didn't come, we were all going to go to Palestine. That was before Israel. So we would go to Palestine, and that idea excited me. I really wanted to go to Palestine. It was the way that they were talking about it, it was fun. And they taught us how to dance the hora, and it was great. But within only 1 week before all the kids would go to Palestine, one of my uncles found me. How did he find me? They came around to all the kids who were there. They asked us for our names, and some of us remember our real names, some of us didn't remember. They wrote down the information, and in Belgium, they placed all that information around all the telephone poles. And one of my uncles found me like that. Anyway, so having said this, I also have an aunt, and her name is Becky, and she was my father's sister. At a certain time, my father, he lost all his money. He didn't have any more money to pay this woman, and the woman was not happy that she didn't get any money to try to find non-Jewish people to hide me. She denounced my parents to the Gestapo. That was during the war. And she also denounced my aunt and uncle, Annie's parents. So both of our parents were denounced by that same woman to the Gestapo, and because of that, they were taken away, and they were going to go to a concentration camp. My aunt and uncle, Annie's parents, were sent. Her mother was sent to a place. Both of them were sent in Germany. They were sent to a place called Ravensbrück. Her husband was sent to a place called Buchenwald. Both camps were in Germany. My parents were sent here to Auschwitz. So my father went to Auschwitz #1, and my mother was sent to Birkenau. My father had he had difficulty with his feet. He had flat feet, and he couldn't walk, and it was very difficult. Then he couldn't work. In Auschwitz #1, there was no room for people who could not work. And we don't know how he died. We don't know how he was murdered. But lo and behold, in 1943, at the age of 31 years old, we lost my father. On my mother's side, my mother was a very strong woman. And when they did the triage meant they were choosing the people to go to work or not. So my mother was chosen to go to work, and she was sent to the right. And then her sister, that was here already, was sent to the left. And therefore my mother would go to work, and her sister would not. And my mother's sister was crying. Her name was Frida. And she was crying, and my mother thought she wanted to go and help her. And she went to her sister, and while she was crying, and then her Frida told my mother, "Please go back to the other side. You shouldn't be here." And there was a woman that knew the two sisters, and also came from Belgium, that heard that whole story between the two sisters. So therefore, how did I know what was going on here in Birkenau when I was a little boy and they were going to be chosen to either go to work or not? She heard all that, and then I spoke to, and she survived, and I spoke to that woman when I was in Belgium, and she told me the whole story. I want to share something that was, to me, was a very special kind of a story about my of what happened to when they found out about my mother, whether she died or whether she survived. My mother was in Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, and one day they said that a train was coming from Birkenau with prisoners from Birkenau. So my aunt ran towards that train and was yelling my mother's name. She was trying to find my mother, and she ran. One train stopped, 2 trains stopped, 3 trains, and then she stopped, and a young girl came over and said, "I knew Dvora," because my aunt was yelling my mother's name. My mother's name was Dvora Buckman. And then she says, "I knew Dvora, but she's dead." And my Aunt Becky asked her, how did you know her? And then she said, I'm from Belgium, and I used to babysit Dvora's son, which was me. So, Becky was not a religious woman, but when she wanted to talk to God, she looked up to the sky and she made herself a promise, and she said, if I will survive Ravensbrück, if I will go back to Belgium, if I will find my husband, and if I will find Alex, I will raise him as my son. And she did. So she raised me, and we lived in Belgium until I was 11 years old. And at 11 years old, in 1951, we left Belgium to go to Canada. And we went to Canada in 1951 in Montreal. We stayed in Montreal till I was in 1967. I had my son 5 years before that, and we went to British Columbia, to Vancouver. This is where we live right now. Instead of living in Vancouver, I live in Surrey. We moved from North Vancouver to Surrey to be closer to my grandkids. We have 3 grandkids, a little girl, 23, 2 boys, 25 and 27. Fantastic kids. And that's about it. I was told to speak as fast as possible by the big boss. And on Friday, I'm going to ask you to ask me some questions, and I'll continue on to say whatever I have to say about what happened to my family. So the question and answer period will be on Friday, okay? So you have enough time from now till Friday to figure out what kind of questions you want to ask me. I know for a fact that sometimes it's hard to ask questions to people like myself. But if I had enough guts to speak to you, then you should have enough guts to ask me questions, okay? Is that a deal? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Alex, if it's okay with you, we want to dedicate us walking here in honor and in memory of your parents.
Okay. Okay. Wow. I don't know how you feel about this place. But I found it very hard. Not because of the walk, not because of how long we took, but simply knowing the fact that my mother was here before me. My mother, Dvora, when they murdered her in 1943, she was 32 years old. And my mother was a very tough woman, very strong, but she was a kind woman. And my father was even kinder. I met a lot of people in Belgium after the war. I never met anyone that didn't like my father. My father was a very kind man, and anyway, I find it tough that to know that my parents had to die. Had to die in a place like this. But it happened. I wasn't the only one in Belgium, with so many people that were there that had lost their parents, like myself. When I was a kid growing up, after the war, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. We used to meet a lot of times in groups, bigger groups than this. And people talked about their parents, what they knew, what happened to them. And everything was here in this place. I know.
No. Fini avec ça?
Now he's hot.
Yeah. You can still wear it. Yeah, c'était incroyable. Merci beaucoup.
I'm going to give you a recipe of a cake that, come on, Alex. A recipe of a cake that Becky, my aunt, wrote in Ravensbrück in 1943. And when you're going to go home, I'm going to ask you to make the cake with, and when you'll make it, I'm going to ask you to make it with your, if it's possible, with your siblings and with your parents. That's all I ask.
Thank you.
Okay? Okay.